We're going to read the two fables on page 400, then compare and contrast them on page 401. So the first fable is The Dog and His Reflection. The closed reader habit down below says when you reread the fables, underline the sentences that give key details about each character's greed. So we're looking for details about each character's greed. The Dog and His Reflection. A dog, to whom the butcher had thrown a bone, was hurrying home with his prize as fast as he could go. As he crossed a narrow footbridge, he happened to look down and saw himself reflected in the quiet water as if in a mirror. But the greedy dog thought he saw a real dog, and not just a real dog, a dog carrying a bone much bigger than his own. And that last sentence there needs to be underlined because it shows us the dog's greed. It shows us how he has a bone, but he sees a dog, he thinks he sees a dog with a bigger bone, and he wants the bigger bone. If he had stopped to think, the dog would have known better. But instead of thinking, he dropped his bone and sprang at the dog he saw in the river. To his great surprise, he found himself swimming for dear life to reach the shore. At last he managed to scramble out. As he stood sadly thinking about the good bone he had lost, he realized what a stupid dog he had been. Alright, now we're going to read The Swollen Fox. And we're going to again look for a line that gives details about the character's greed and underline it. A hungry fox found in a hollow tree a quantity of bread and meat which some shepherds had hidden there for later use. Delighted with his food, the fox slipped in through the narrow aperture and greedily devoured it all. First of all, what's an aperture? He slipped in through the narrow aperture and greedily devoured it all. That means there was a small opening, that's what aperture means, and he went into it, and then he ate everything in there. So that tells us about his greed. He could have taken everything out and gone and taken it to his home and eaten a little bit out of time, but instead he snuck in there and ate it all. But when he tried to get out again, he found himself so swollen after his big meal that he could not squeeze through the hole. Distraught, he fell to whining and groaning over his misfortune. Another fox, happening to pass that way, came and asked him what the matter was. On learning what had happened, the second fox said, "Well, my friend, I see nothing for it but for you to stay where you are. Soon you'll shrink to your former size, and then you'll get out then easily enough." So he had gotten so fat from eating everything that he just had to sit there and wait. If he had just taken everything out and eaten a little bit at a time, if his greed hadn't gotten hold of him, then he would have been able to get out. Now we're going to compare and contrast the two on the following page. So in the bubble on the left, we're going to talk about the dog and his reflection. So in the dog and his reflection, the dog has a bone. He sees what he thinks is a dog with a bigger bone, and then he loses his bone trying to get to the bigger bone. The dog's greed for the bone he sees in his reflection causes him to lose the bone he has. The dog's greed nearly causes him to drown as he swims back to shore. Because when he dropped his bone, he jumped in trying to get the bigger bone, and he couldn't swim and he had to hurry back to shore. Alright, in the swollen fox, the fox found some food that hunters had hidden, and he snuck in and ate it all, and then he had to sit there and wait to shrink back down so he could get out. The fox's greed for the shepherd's food causes him to get stuck in a tree. No one can help the fox. He has to wait until he shrinks back down to normal size. And now, how are the two stories alike? They're both about greed. They're both fables. They both use an animal to teach a moral. And both the dog and the fox regret their decision. The dog's like, "Man, I wish I hadn't dropped my bone." And the fox is like, "Wow, I wish I hadn't eaten all this. Now I'm stuck in this tree by myself." So they both regret the decision they made. Both are fables, both use animals to show how greed leads to bad endings, and both animals regret their actions. You can write it in the words that I said, you can write it in your own words, or you can write it in the words on the answer key. Now we're going to answer the short response. How does each fable develop the topic of greed? Use details from each story in your response. Use the space provided on page 406. So if we turn on page 406, we're going to use the things that we underlined to describe how the two stories give us examples about greed. So this is a sample response. Yours can be like this, or it can be different. Both fables warn readers about the negative outcomes of greed, but they do so with different characters, settings, and events. In The Dog and His Reflection, a dog nearly drowns because he wants a bigger bone. He also loses his bone he has by dropping it in the river. In The Swollen Fox, a fox gets stuck in a hole in a tree because he has eaten too much food. Even his friend can't help him. Both animals regret their actions and realize too late that they shouldn't have been so greedy. So you can use that answer, or you can use one of your own that is similar. If you have questions, please email me.